All right, hi everybody. I'm Caro. I'll just take off my mask while I'm speaking. I'm a volunteer with NOFA Mass and a former staff member as well. So you're attending Tips for Success with Home Garden Vegetables with one of my all-time favorite NOFA winter conference and summer conference presenters, Christie Higginbottom. Christie has worked as a costume interpreter at Old Sturbridge Village since 1981. From 1984 to 2004, she coordinated the historic horticulture program, researching, planning, and planting recreated kitchen and flower gardens at the museum's historic households. From 2004 to 2011, as a research historian for horticulture and landscape, she developed a series of self-guided walking trails, interpreting people and the environment in the early 1800s. So Christie now is retired from that and writes and consults on historic gardens, heirloom plants, and herb use, and lectures at museums, garden clubs, historical societies, and libraries, and of course NOFA, and enjoys teaching home gardening workshops. So before we jump in, I just have a few details to share with you. So let me just advance the slides. Great. So NOFA Mass is strengthening our relationship to racial equity and justice by examining whiteness and dismantling systems of white supremacy that are part of many dominant systems, including our agriculture and food systems. We want to honor the Indigenous land stewards who are the original occupants of this land that we are currently on. We are Nipmuc land. After Christie gets started, I'll just drop a link in the chat so you can use this map from home as well. Let's see. Welcome, come on in. We want to call on everyone, especially white allies and co-conspirators, to action on a few items to assist BIPOC-led organizations. So those actions are listed on the slide. And please do consider participating in our BIPOC and white ally caucuses today, this afternoon. You can see the location on those slides. So thank you so much to our partner level sponsors and to our supporter level sponsors. Come on in, hi, welcome, we're just getting started. And you can also check out the auction. The link is right there. I will also drop it in the chat during the session. And I don't really know what that link is for, sorry. I'm gonna switch it to Christie's slides now. At this point, I am going to hand it over to Christie, and I will also be periodically monitoring the chat. So if you are attending from home and you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and I will check that. I think you can take over.
Thank you, Carol.
Absolutely.
It's always great to be back at a NOFA conference, and this is one of my favorite topics to share with folks. I wanted to get a quick sense when we start just of your own experience. So are most of you, if you're a home gardener, can you let me know? Okay, primarily home gardeners. Anybody doing farm gardening? Okay, that helps me out with getting a sense for where we're at here. I'm a home gardener, have been for a long time, in addition to the work that I've done at Old Sturbridge Village with the historic gardens there. So I wanted to start out by introducing the approach that I'm currently taking to teaching about vegetables, and it's what I call plant empathy. It's an approach that some of my favorite teachers have used with me, and so I really enjoy it. Essentially, I follow Barbara Damrosch's quote where she says, "Good gardening is simple, really. You just have to learn to think like a plant." And so this is the way I'm going to be approaching a lot of what I'm going to be talking about with you today. I've got it.
Oh, you got it.
Yeah, we're all set. Okay, to start out for home vegetable gardeners, I think one of the important aspects to understand as a home gardener and working with vegetables is plant families. This is going to be helpful because you might want to plan on I'll be talking about some of the reasons why rotating crops in a garden is a good idea. And plant families are a lot like human families in many respects. Plants that share family are plants that also share a lot of diseases and insect problems, but they also share positive traits as well. And those are things that we can work with as we plan our gardens and plan where we're going to be locating plants in the garden. And so the common vegetable garden families that we're going to be looking at are the cucurbit family, which includes the squashes and the cucumbers and melons, the vining crops that you grow in your garden. It includes the Solanaceae family, probably one of the biggest and most common plant families in a home vegetable garden because it includes the tomato. How many people grow tomatoes? In the 19th century, the gardens at Old Sturbridge Village, the tomato wasn't common at all, surprisingly. Very few people grew it. But in the 21st century, of course, it's probably the most common home garden vegetable. So tomatoes are also related to peppers. They're related to eggplants. They're related to potatoes. And so it's important to understand those plant relationships as we plan our gardens. Also the alliums, onions, leeks, these plants are all in the same family. Garlic shares that family. And the carrot family, which includes root vegetables like carrots, but it also includes things like celery and parsley and other common garden vegetables. And then the legumes, the bean and pea family, and the beet family, which includes not only beets, but several of the greens that we commonly grow, like Swiss chard, for example, and spinach. These are all plants that are in the same plant family. And then another real key plant family to be aware of in the home garden is the cruciferous family, the brassicas. That's cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. These plants are all related to one another. And the grasses, corn. I'm not going to talk a lot about corn today. One reason I often don't include it in home garden talks is because it can require quite a bit of space. The basic thing really to understand about growing corn successfully is to understand about how it's pollinated. And that is to understand, if you think about an ear of corn, which is a bunch of seeds all on a cob with a tassel sticking out of the top of that. And then you've got a tassel on the top of your corn plant. That's the part that produces the pollen. On your ear of corn, every one of those silks that's hanging out of the top of an ear of corn is attached to one of the seeds on that cob. And it is that silk that transfers the pollen to that seed. And if that seed doesn't receive any pollen, it's not going to grow. If you've ever harvested corn and found that half of your corn cob has fully developed kernels on it and the other half has nothing at all, that's incomplete pollination. And pollination happens by wind. When the wind shakes those plants and the pollen falls from the tassel on the top down to be distributed onto the silks on that single ear. In a home garden, the best way to be successful with corn is to plant a large plot of it, about 12 feet by 12 feet. That guarantees that you're going to have a lot of corn plants all growing side by side in a unit. And that's going to up the chances that when the wind blows, pollen is going to fall onto the silks of those ears. If you try to grow a single row of corn in your home garden, you may be setting yourself up for disappointment. Because if the wind blows the pollen away from that row and it falls on the beets next door, it's not going to do your corn any good. So the best way to grow good corn is to grow it fairly densely. And because it can take a large amount of space, a lot of home gardeners may find that their garden isn't really large enough to accommodate enough corn to make it worth growing. I don't want to discourage you from growing corn, certainly if it's a favorite crop. And if you have the space to be able to do it fairly densely, go right ahead. But I want people to understand that if you've had poor luck with corn, pollination is probably the main reason. And it's wind pollination that takes place with your corn crops. So that will be my discussion about corn. If you have questions later on, I'd be glad to cover those. So the great thing about crop rotation is that if we put all of the closely related plants together in an area in the garden, And then the next year, we move those plants to another area in the garden. What we're doing is we're reducing the chances that the shared diseases of those plants are going to increase in that area in the garden. So we don't want to keep growing closely related plants on the same piece of ground year after year. A lot of the diseases that infect them can live in the soil. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. A lot of the insects can live in the soil from one season to another. And what we want to do is prevent those kinds of things from happening, to lower the chances of that. Crop rotation can be challenging for home gardeners because oftentimes our gardens are relatively small. And so it becomes hard to find enough space to move plants around. So I want to acknowledge that right up front. But I also want to acknowledge that if you understand the value of crop rotation, then hopefully what you'll be able to do is to make your best efforts to try and rotate crops. It will also help you to understand if you are having a problem with a particular crop. If you can see that it's been growing in the same place for a long time, that may help you to understand why those problems are occurring.
Is that universally true?
Well, I'm going to talk about it in a minute. It has a greater impact with some plant families than others. So the two plant families that have the highest risk of building up diseases in the soil are the Solanaceae, the tomato, potato, pepper family, and the crucifers, the cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower family. Those are the two plant families that are at the highest risk of building up diseases in the soil. So if you can't rotate everything, those are the two that you should prioritize moving around. An ideal rotation would be not to grow those plants in the same piece of ground more often than once every 3 years. Again, that can be a challenge for the home gardener. I'm going to show you in a few minutes how I try and accomplish that with a relatively small home garden. But the other plant families have less of a problem with that. And so the priority would be with those two plant families. But it's important also to know that rotating plants in a garden can be beneficial too. When we hear about crop rotation, the people that talk about it are often talking about what I've just told you, the risks of growing crops in the same place for a long time. But some of the crops, in particular, things like root vegetables, moving those around is actually beneficial. When root vegetables grow, they grow down into the soil and they break up the soil. Also, our own soil preparation to get ready to grow root vegetables usually involves loosening the soil in that area. That means that when those plants move on to a different place and you move in something like, say, lettuces that have fibrous roots, or some of the other plant families we just talked about that have more fibrous roots, when you move those into that ground where the root crops grew the year before, they will benefit from that looser soil that you prepared and that those crops developed for you. You may have heard, and certainly there are more workshops today on the topic of reducing tillage in our gardens, the importance of not disturbing the soil too much to mess up the layers of the soil microorganisms, their strata in the soil. So by using minimal preparation for root crops and allowing those root crops to help develop the soil, that means the next year you can use a minimum of soil tillage and disturbance to prepare the soil for the next year's crop. So root vegetables in the garden are going to benefit you by moving around. Likewise, legumes, beans and peas are going to benefit you by moving around. The bean and pea family has special talents. They team up with rhizobia bacteria that live in your soil. And that teaming of the roots of these plants and the bacteria in the soil allows the bean and pea family to gather nitrogen out of the air, something that most plants can't do. And as I'm going to mention shortly, nitrogen is the principal nutrient that plants really depend on. They depend on it for a lot of things, but primarily to develop the green parts of the plant, the stems and the leaves of the plant. To have healthy stems and leaves, plants need a decent quantity of nitrogen. And what the legumes can do is they can pull that right out of the air and utilize it. Other plants don't have that talent. And what they do is they fix that nitrogen, as you can see in the image on the screen here, they fix that nitrogen on their roots. And when you remove beans and peas from your garden, the next time you do that, look carefully at the roots, the little hairy roots on those plants, and you'll see little nodules like you see here. And those are the deposits of nitrogen that those plants have developed. So it's a good idea to leave those roots in your soil or to incorporate them into your compost if you can't leave them in the soil, because what those plants are doing is they're actually fertilizing your garden for you. And they are functioning without having to have excessive nitrogen provided for them by other means. And so moving them around will enrich the soil for you. So lots of good reasons to practice a soil, a plant rotation system in your garden, and to understand those plant families and their good points and their weaknesses. So just to give you an idea, this is my home garden is not huge. It's 30 feet by 36 feet. And I use an old-fashioned garden design known as the 4-square garden. And so you can notice in my garden, you'll notice principal paths in my garden, the wider paths, those are permanent paths. They stay in place. I'll show you an image of them in a minute. And they divide my garden into 4 quarters. That allows me to practice a crop rotation system in a relatively small garden. It still means it's not perfect. When I work with tools and move from one part of my garden to the other, I can transport diseased soil or insects. I recognize that. But it gives me, as long as I'm aware of those risks, it gives me a good opportunity to move things around on at least a 3-year or even a 4-year rotation within my garden. And so you'll notice in the upper part of the garden a section devoted to potatoes and tomatoes and peppers, for example, all those Solanaceae crops put together. And you'll also notice that I've got cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and broccoli all growing in the same quarter of the garden. Other plant families I can mix around. The beans I can put in wherever they'll fit in neatly, where they've got space and where they'll get sufficient light. I also want you to notice that my garden includes compass orientations. You'll see south, north, east, and west designated on here. When you plan a garden, I highly advise you to make a garden on a piece of graph paper, like garden plan on a piece of graph paper like this. If at this time of the year, when you're ordering your seeds and you're starting to think about the upcoming garden season, it's a great time to begin plotting out a plan like this. Figure how much space you need to devote to things so that they'll get the room that they need, to plan it out in your mind so that you've got this all in place, and then to keep that plan. Because let me tell you, I mean, I've been gardening for a long time now, and my memory gets worse every single year. Trying to remember what was growing in that area, even last year, sometimes it's really hard for me to recall that. By keeping these plans, you can keep a record of where things were growing. And I'll mention later even more, by keeping a journal of where and when you plant things, that will help you to learn from your own experiences. If you move things, how did it benefit the garden? If they stayed in the same place for a long time, did you notice any detriments from that kind of thing? So we learn by talking with other gardeners, by reading good books on the subject, but we learn the most about our gardens by interacting with our plants and developing this plant empathy that you get by paying attention to what's happening. So here's an example in my garden. There's that quarter with potatoes and tomatoes. My rhubarb, a perennial crop that stays in one spot in the garden from year to year, is also in that quarter. But there's that quarter of the garden. It also allows you to see one of those principal paths in the garden. The year that this image was taken, I had top dressed that path with wood chips. And I wanted to mention that now. Wood chips are a great mulch, but fresh wood chips are very high in carbon. That's a good thing for the soil, but as it breaks down, in order for carbon to break down in your soil, it has to team up. The soil microorganisms have to use a lot of nitrogen to do that. So if you put fresh wood chips around your crops, you may see a decline in the green leafy part of that crop, because as those wood chips break down, they're stealing some nitrogen out of the soil. My way to deal with that is to top dress my main paths with those when they're fresh. And then after they've broken down, I can scoop them up and use them in the garden as a mulch.
What leaves?
I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes, but that's what you're seeing underneath the plants in the beds here, is chopped up leaves.
But you would actually take, that's something I did, was have the wood chips and then the decompose, shove it in green beds in the garden.
Right, as long as you're
So
aware.
it was a path, and then, but that, once it's decomposed, then you go.
Yes, yeah, once it's decomposed, then it's not robbing that nitrogen any longer. It's mostly when they're fresh and they're just starting to break down that they do that. They're not bad, but you need to understand the impact they're going to have.
Christie, sorry.
How
Can I
long?
just interject as a moderator? If you could repeat the question so that the folks who are on Zoom can hear what the question was, that would be great.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah, sorry.
How long?
I usually watch what they look like. So you can see from the image here, those are really fresh wood chips. They're going to turn dark brown. They're going to begin to break down, usually a year. So if I put them on the path and leave them on the path for that summer and then through that winter, and then the next spring as I'm starting to prepare the garden, then I can use them as a mulch between the beds in my growing part of my garden. So here's another quarter of that 4 square garden. And another advantage of dividing your garden into quarters like this is I've devoted this particular quarter all to early crops. These are things that go into the garden even while there's still a danger of frost. That's another thing to be really aware of as a home gardener. I think when I was growing up, we depend so heavily on things like tomatoes and cucumbers that we can think that gardening doesn't start until Memorial Day. That was the traditional time when you started putting things in the ground. But there are a whole bunch of really great vegetables that not only can go in the garden earlier, but as I'm going to tell you in a few minutes, they have to go in the garden earlier if you want them to be healthy, because they prefer cool weather. And so this, by devoting a quarter of the garden to those early crops, that helps me if I'm restricted with time in prepping my garden. I can get that quarter all ready and know that I can put a bunch of crops into that. Also, many of the crops that are in here, the peas, the lettuce, the spinach, the chives are a perennial, but the onions, the peas, the lettuce, and the spinach, all of those crops are going to be harvested and out of the ground by the middle of July. And that gives me a chance to actually sow a second crop, to do what's called succession sowing. So there are crops like carrots, for example, that will grow into the fall and don't mind the frost at all in the fall. They can be planted in the middle of summer to give you a second succession crop. So that's how I use this particular quarter of my garden. And then on the very same day, just to show you how different your garden is going to look depending on when things start in the ground, this is my root vegetable section of the garden. So this is where there are parsnips, beets, and carrots just getting started from seed in the middle of June, and a tripod in the back for some pole beans growing in this section of the garden. So it gives you a sense for how a garden can proceed. And I learned about this 4 square kitchen garden plan from my work on historic gardens, because it's a very old design idea, and it has a whole bunch of different advantages to recommend it. If your garden's big enough to be able to admit you to try that plan, I highly recommend it. So the other thing we're going to want to do as we work with vegetables is try to avoid stressing them. Again, this is plant empathy. We know what stress can do to us, and it can do the same kinds of things to plants. So a plant that is stressed oftentimes has trouble using nutrients properly and using food properly. A plant that is stressed is much more susceptible to insect and disease problems, just like when we're stressed, we're more likely to get sick. And stress also will reduce the yield in plants. They just can't produce enough if they are stressed. And stress will also encourage premature flowering and seeding, what's called bolting. And you may have experienced this in your garden. So an example of this is lettuce. One of the things that's important to learn to develop empathy with your vegetables also, in addition to the families they belong to, is to learn about their life cycles. Most of the vegetables that we grow in our garden are either annuals or biennials. Now, an annual is a plant that completes its whole life cycle within one growing season. Annual vegetables like lettuce that can tolerate cold well can start out in spring, and they can be all done with their whole life cycle, from seed in the ground to producing flowers and seeds on their plant before the middle of summer. They have a very short lifespan. And since I tell folks a plant's contract with Mother Nature, the first thing in that contract is you must make seeds in order to keep your species going. And so that's the number one priority for the vegetable. If it feels stressed, then it knows it's going to have to complete that seeding to complete its contract. So it's going to stop doing everything else and it's going to focus on making seeds. And that's called bolting. So what you're seeing in the image here is a lettuce plant that is bolted. Now this is going to happen to your lettuce plants, but what you want to try and do is keep your plants growing as long and as productive as possible before they do that. Because when lettuce begins to bolt, it's not really good to eat anymore. It develops bitter flavor to it. And so we want to avoid stressing it. So if we can keep plants evenly moist, if a plant goes suddenly dry for a period of time and then it gets suddenly soaking wet, has this extreme of moisture from dry to soaking, that causes stress in the plant. If it feels that stress, one of the responses may be to bolt. And then you're going to lose the productivity in that plant because it's going to shift gears. And so this is a good example. I'm going to mention a couple of other examples in a minute. Another thing that's really critical to avoid stressing our plants is nutrition. And this is really a fairly obvious thing, but just a couple of things to help you keep that in mind. There are really, when I approach my garden and fertilizing and feeding plants, I divide that into two categories. There are what are called slow release fertilizers, things that you add to the soil that can't be available to your plants until the cooks in your soil, those soil microorganisms that live in your healthy garden soil, they're the ones that prepare the menu for your plants. They're the ones that take those various components, things like compost, well-rotted manure, and organic fertilizer blends, the minerals that we add to our soil. The soil microorganisms, and there's a whole range of those, and there are other workshops today that are focusing on that element. They break down those components. That's why they're called slow release, because they're not ready to eat right away. And they break down those components so that the components then can be dissolved in water. When they get to that point, to think of it as the soup stage, when they get to that point, then plants can eat them. Before that, they may be there, but they're not really available for your plant. So those are the slow release fertilizers. You want to make sure that you have those in your soil, because that's sort of like going to a buffet where they keep bringing more food out, putting it out for you, and you can keep going up and eating. Then there are liquid feed fertilizers, and fertilizers, most of the fertilizers that we as organic farmers use are not those ones that are immediately water soluble. We want the slow release type. But there are liquid fertilizers, things like fish emulsion, seaweed emulsion, or compost tea, which you can make by just taking some of your well-developed compost and putting it into a bag. I use an old pillowcase, putting it into a bag and just putting it into a big container of water like a tea bag and letting the minerals from that will dissolve in the water, dissolve into the water, and then watering that onto your plants. Because the nutrients have become dissolved in the liquid, in the fish emulsion, the seaweed emulsion, the compost tea, those are going to be more immediately available to a plant. So if you notice that plants in your garden where you have added fertilizer to the soil, slow release fertilizer before you begin your planting, if you notice at some point during the growing season, particularly when those plants, let's take a squash plant, when it begins to flower and develop the fruits, the squashes on the plant, it may have used up a lot of that fertilizer from the soil. It may now be, and it needs even more because of the hard work it's doing to develop its fruits. And so you may need to give it a quick boost. It's sort of like intravenous feeding in a way. And in fact, many of these slow release fertilizers can actually be taken into the plant right through their leaves. So if you, for example, water a fish emulsion onto the surface of a plant early in the day, it can absorb some of that right through its leaves, and some of it goes into the soil and it can be taken up by its roots, but it's more immediately available. It's also gone quicker because it's dissolvable. You get a rain or you water, it's going to leach out of the soil. So when we're thinking about feeding plants, we need to think about a balance between the slow release fertilizers that are like that buffet table and the quick release fertilizers that are like the intravenous feeding. And we need a balance of both. We can't rely easily on only one form of fertilizer. We're looking to feed in both ways. And then just as a kind of real quickie, fertilizers and soil nutrients are a complicated subject that I can't go into in huge amount of detail in this talk today, but you can find information in other talks today on it. But just a kind of quick summary, the fertilizers that are high in nitrogen, as I mentioned, those are going to primarily promote stem and leaf growth in plants. And so they're going to be really important for the plants and where you're focusing on eating leaves. They're going to be important for all the plants because leaves are where they photosynthesize. But if you want great lettuce or spinach and you don't give it enough nitrogen, you're not going to get a lot of leaves or a lot of really healthy leaves. Phosphorus promotes root growth, it promotes flowering and fruits. And when I say fruits, this is an important term to clarify. We tend to think of fruits and vegetables. Vegetable is really a cook's word more than a botanist's word. So in your vegetable garden, some of the most important plants in your garden are plants where you harvest the fruit. Technically, the fruit of a plant is the part of the plant that contains the seeds. So when you eat beans, you're eating a fruit. When you eat peppers, you're eating a fruit. Cucumbers are a fruit. And so keep that in mind when I talk about fruits here. Those are some of the things that I'm going to be mostly talking about are the parts of the plant that contain the seeds of your plant. And if those are the parts that you're primarily involved with growing, then they're going to need some phosphorus. Potassium is a soil nutrient that supports flowering, it supports fruit growth, and quite importantly, a plant having enough of that is going to have a higher disease resistance also. So these are just a quick summary. But then, just like for people, some of the things that are really key in our diets are things that we only need minute amounts of, but if they're not there, they can be critical. And we call those in the soil, we call those trace elements. And a couple of them important ones include things like calcium, magnesium, boron for things like beets, for example, sulfur. So just to give you an example of how trace elements can be important. Calcium is a trace element. Plants usually don't need enormous amounts of it, but they need it. Some plants need it more than others, depending on what kind of diseases they're susceptible to. But in this image here, what you see is what's called blossom end rot, and it's very aptly named. The blossom end of your tomato plant will rot. And that is usually caused by a calcium deficiency in the tomato plant's diet. Calcium helps plants build strong cell walls. If the cell walls in the plant are strong, that can prevent diseases from entering the cells and breaking them down. So calcium is really a critical trace element. The tricky thing here, though, as I was saying earlier, is that calcium's only, even if you've got it in your soil, it's only going to be available to the plant if the plant has water in the soil. If the soil is too dry, the plant can't access the calcium. So, for example, when I make sure that I have calcium in the soil for tomatoes, one way I often do that, a fairly simple way, is just to save eggshells. When I'm getting, eggshells are really high in calcium. So when I'm getting, as I'm beginning to get ready to put transplants of tomatoes out into the garden, I don't put my eggshells in my compost. I save them in a bucket, and every tomato plant that goes in the ground, in its planting hole, it gets a bunch of crushed up eggshells to break down and provide some calcium for that plant during the plant's growth. There are other sources of calcium as well. This is one way to keep that in supply. But you've got to keep in mind that in order for that to be there for the plant has got to be evenly moist. It can't go through periods of dry soil. And so this brings us to the importance of watering our plants. Seems really obvious, but it's one of the mistakes that's most often made in our gardens. And what we need to do is to improve our ability to judge the wetness of our soil. If we only water lightly, we might say, oh, I'm going to go out and water the garden. I have about 15 minutes, and I'll go out as you see me here, and you just say, oh, okay, I've watered the garden. When you get through with that, the soil for the top inch may be very moist, and below that, it could be totally dry. And where are the roots in a plant like the onions that you see me watering here? The roots are going to be much further down in the soil than that top inch of soil. And so what we need to do, and there are several ways to make sure that they stay evenly moist. Certainly, we've got to make sure the water is provided. If it doesn't rain enough, then we've got to provide that water with our own watering systems. But I would advise you to get used to finding a spot in your garden where you can put your hands down into the soil after you water to see where is that water, how far down does it go, or even a trowel to pull aside about 6 inches of soil in an area where you won't disturb your plants and look down and see, is the water down there 6 inches down, or have I for 2 weeks only been watering the top inch of soil in my garden so the roots in my plants are sitting in dried out soil? You need to really dig down in and find out if what you're doing is working properly. So we want to prevent extremes. Too much water can be a big problem, and this is one reason why when you locate your garden, you want to make sure that you locate it in a place where the soil is well drained, where water doesn't tend to stand. Roots of plants need oxygen. They need to obtain oxygen from the soil. If the soil is wet all the time, it's going to be like holding your head underwater. The plants aren't going to be able to find any oxygen in completely saturated soil. So heavy rains or a soil in an area where water tends to stand, that's going to be a problem for your garden plants. So first of all, choose a location where you're less likely to have that happen on your property. And then improving the soil. This is one of the great things about compost as a soil amendment, is it solves two completely opposite problems. If the soil is too moist in your garden, compost is loose. It has porous quality. It has air pockets in it. So water will easily move down through it and drain out. And so it opens up a soil that's too wet. It also is absorbent. And so it will soak up water into the parts of the compost. So it drains it through the porous part, but the solid parts of the compost soak up water and hold it. And so that holds water for a sandy soil that might be inclined to drain too quickly and dry out too quickly. So compost solves both the too wet and the too dry problem for you in your soil. those are things we need to think about. However, when we're watering can also be a problem if we don't do it properly. It can tend to support, if watering is not done properly, it can support fungal diseases. And as we get more and more hot, damp weather in our summers, fungal diseases are becoming more of a problem with our plants. This is particularly true of the Solanaceae family, the tomatoes and the potatoes, blights, these diseases that are spread by spores. So spores are very fine particles that can blow for miles and miles in the air. And they blow through the air until they come upon a plant that is damp. And when they hit a damp plant, they stick onto that plant. And if that plant stays damp, that allows the fungus to grow and to penetrate the plant. And that's when the disease gets into the plant system. So what you're going to want to do is certainly make sure that your plants get the water below ground that they need in order to access their food, the nutrients that they need. But you want to minimize the moisture above ground on plants. There's not a lot we can do about moisture that's provided by Mother Nature. So if we get a really wet season, a really hot, humid season, then there's not a lot we can do to control that. But what we want to do is control our own watering so we don't contribute to those problems. And so watering in the morning is a good idea rather than watering in the evening. So don't wait till you get home from work at 5 o'clock and then go out and put an overhead sprinkler on your garden. If you do that, what you're doing with the overhead sprinkler is you're dousing that garden with water, and you're doing it late in the day when the chances of that water evaporating away quickly are very low. And those plants are likely to stay wet all night long until the sun comes out the next morning to dry them. And that puts them at high risk for developing fungal diseases if spores blow through during that period of time. If you water in the morning, then air circulation and sunlight should help to dry the plants. And then the other thing is water at the base of the plant. Overhead watering systems may be very efficient in that they can cover a large section of your garden in a very short period of time, but they come with the downside that they are going to saturate plants. The other problem you have with overhead watering is that water goes up in the air and then falls down onto your soil, and it can compact your soil. If you have a soil that is high in clay or silt, you can end up with a highly compacted crust on the surface of your soil just from the pressure of that water coming down on top of it. So it is much better, if possible, to develop a watering system where you water at the base of the plants rather than dropping water from way up above the plants. That can be done with soaker hoses, drip irrigation systems, and also by putting a mulch onto the surface of the soil that will reduce any impact. You're going to get that same kind of heavy-duty impact when you get a real heavy thunderstorm. Mother Nature provides rain, and it comes down so hard, as we know we're getting more and more often in the summer, that it can compact the soil. If you have a mulch on the surface of the soil, that's going to break that up and protect the surface of the soil. And we also want to prevent what's called soil splash. So here's an example of blight, one of those fungal diseases that is becoming more and more common, and which is increased by that intense wetness around plants for long periods of time. Spreads very rapidly by spores, especially in warm, damp weather, which really supports those diseases, and when foliage stays wet. And these spore-borne diseases can remain in the soil. So those spores can drop down and get into your soil and stay there until the conditions are right for them to then infect another plant. So this is one reason why we do crop rotation. If we have plants that, like potatoes and tomatoes, both share a susceptibility to this blight fungus. If we grow them year after year in the same place in the garden, we up the chances that when they get infected with that, then that infection will remain in the soil. It'll come back very quickly. You much more easily in the following year, and it can increase from year to year. And so crop rotation is one way to try and stop that and prevent it. It also can overwinter in the tubers of potatoes. So this is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we purchase disease-free potatoes. Eons ago, back in the period of time that I worked, that I showed at Old Sturbridge Village, the 19th century gardener would commonly use saved potatoes from his or her own crop to replant the next year. But as fungal diseases became more and more prevalent, people discovered that that was not a good idea, because if those plants had been infected the year before, you were going to continue that, maintain that, and increase it in your garden soil. So now what we're looking for is to start with tubers that have been purchased from sources where we know we're less likely to obtain diseases from them. And then also practicing good garden hygiene. So when you see any of these infected plants in your garden, the minute you see them with tomato plants, you can often minimize that. If you catch the disease early, it will often start on the lowest leaves of tomato plants. And if you monitor your plants and remove those leaves carefully, again, handling those leaves and then handling other parts of your plant can cause you to spread those spore-borne diseases with your hands or with tools. So if you're going out early in the day to monitor some diseased portions of plants, just focus on that activity so that you clean your hands and your tools before you go about other garden activities in your garden. But you can often slow that way down and prevent it by removing diseased portions of the plant early on. If a plant becomes really infected, then you want to get the whole plant out of there. It can be hard to do, especially if you raised it from seed, but it's a good idea because you end up with losing a lot more plants if you don't do that. So good garden hygiene. And don't put these infected plants into your compost to break down, because compost needs to get up to a really high temperature in order to kill these diseases. And the typical home compost pile, we really don't have a degree of monitoring and control over it to make sure that it's going to reach temperatures that are going to stop these diseases. So my rule of thumb is I never put anything that has any questionable quality into my compost pile. So here's some tomato plants to show you just some of the preventive things you can do to kind of minimize soil splash. So first one is putting a mulch down. With plants that like it hot, it's a good idea to make sure your soil is warm before you put your mulch on top of it, because the mulch will act like an insulation. And so if it's a plant that likes a warm soil, I usually hold off if there's any reason to think that soil is still a little bit cool, but wait until it can warm up before I mulch. But I mulch just as soon as possible to cut down on that soil splash. Then soaker hoses. You maybe can see here at the base of the tomato plants, my soaker hose that I bury. I twine it right in around the area before I put my plants in, so that I know that it's going to provide below ground water for these plants. It's like about 3 to 4 inches below the surface of the soil. Then I plant into that area, and then I can hook that up to my outdoor rain barrels, where I capture rainwater off the eaves of a nearby building. And I can hook that up with a hose to a rain barrel and let that just drip into that soaker hose to moisten the soil. I monitor that by pulling back the mulch from time to time, putting my fingers down into the soil to see what that soil feels like, make sure I'm maintaining even moisture, not going through wet and dry periods. Another thing that I've done with individual plants is the recycled bottle drip method. I use this one where it works. One of the plantings in my garden where it works really well is celery. Celery really likes to stay moist. It's real important for celery plants to keep them constantly moist. So when I put in my celery transplants, I put a plastic bottle where I've poked the whole bottom of that bottle full of holes and just set it right down in the ground right next to my celery plant. And then I can, after I after I do my regular watering of my celery, I just fill each of those bottles up, and that provides a slow release drip irrigation to kind of keep that watering going afterwards. And then the watering can, a good watering can and hand watering. It's got to be done to the point where you really saturate the soil, not just the surface. But that allows you to apply water right at the base of the plant. Either that or a wand at the end of a hose, or you can direct the water right to the base of the plant without wetting the foliage of the plant while you're watering. And then a good mulch, I mentioned earlier. Mulches, when we think about mulches, what we're usually told is we put mulch down to stop weed growth. Sure, that's one of the best things it does. We also put a mulch down in order to prevent water evaporation from the soil, so it helps keep our soil evenly moist. But there are many other mulch advantages that I think don't get promoted as often as, and we aren't as aware of them. But certainly one of those is to prevent disease from soil splash. So if you've got a good mulch, as I had in the tomato plant image here, if you've got a layer of mulch under those tomato plants, if there's any chance that there are soil-borne diseases in your soil, what that does is it provides a barrier. So when we get a heavy rainstorm, it's going to prevent soil from splashing up onto the bottom of the plants. One of the reasons why these diseases often begin to show up first on the lowest leaves of the plants is because they're often transmitted by the soil that splashes up onto those low leaves with disease organisms in it. If you can provide a barrier to prevent that from happening, you can mitigate a lot of those problems. The other thing that good mulch does is it prevents soil compaction and crusting on the surface of the soil. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the heavy rainstorms that we've been getting have been causing an increased problem of compacted soil, which pushes the oxygen right out of the soil and is real detrimental to root growth in your plants. And crusting, which can be a really problem for seed emergence many times. So putting a mulch down on the surface of the soil will prevent that heavy impact from causing those kinds of problems. Mulches also modify soil temperature. As I mentioned earlier, if your plants are plants that want really warm soil, you want to be cognizant of that so that you don't mulch them too early and keep the soil around them cool. But a lot of the plants that we grow, and I'll mention several of them in a minute, are plants that really like it to be cool. They want the soil to be cool, and they suffer when the soil starts to get hot. Broccoli is a classic example, cabbages, lettuce. And so the earlier you get the mulch on those plants, the better, because what it will do is it will help keep that soil cool longer. It will act as an insulation on the top of the soil, keeping it cooler longer. Peas like the soil to stay cool. So mulching them as early as possible is a good thing. And then, of course, the mulch adds organic material to your soil. We've got a lot of different kinds of things we can mulch with, and these are all welcomed by soil microorganisms. The more of those that you have on the surface of the soil, and the more different ones that you use in your garden, the broader the population of soil or microorganisms is going to be. If you put down, we talked earlier about leaves as a mulch, chopped leaves. If you use chopped leaves, the only caution is make sure you don't use any black walnut leaves. I have a lot of black walnut trees in my yard. One of them is probably a couple hundred years old and one of my favorite trees, but I make sure I don't put any of the leaves from it into my compost or into my mulch, because black walnut trees contain a substance called juglone. And juglone is great for the walnut tree because what happens when it goes into the soil is it suppresses the growth of other competing plants around that tree. So it gives the walnut kind of the domain dominance, and you wouldn't want those kinds of substances to show up in your vegetable garden because they'll suppress the growth of plants. So avoid black walnut leaves. What I do to make a good mulch out of leaves is we rake up our leaves in the fall, and then we take our lawnmower and just make a pile of those leaves and chop them all up. The more finely they're chopped, the faster they're going to break down. I put a pile of those aside in the fall, and then I begin applying those each spring. So I will, throughout the summer, I will have a supply of chopped leaves that I can keep adding and amending to the soil. In the fall, I renew that supply of leaves and continue to add it. Things like straw and hay, you see some straw mulch in the image here. Those are good mulches. Hay, oftentimes people will say, oh, don't use hay because it can have weed seeds, and that's true. Hay, when hay is harvested, you often have a bunch of other plants that grow in hay fields that you might not welcome in your vegetable garden. If I have used it, when people ask me what kind of mulch should you use, I say, well, first of all, whatever you can get. And then secondly, you can start to be fussy, but you want to mulch on your plants. And I think, you know, if sometimes if you have something else like a leaf mulch below your hay mulch, or if you use cardboard or paper on the surface of the soil and then use your hay mulch over it, that can help to inhibit weed seed growth from the hay. So there are a lot of different substances that you can use for safe mulches. Combining them will really provide a great soil environment for your plants. So then another thing that we need to be really aware of in the garden is crop spacing. And I usually show an image of root vegetables when I start talking about this, because I think that's one of the crops that sometimes people don't space properly, because the useful part of the plant that you're going to be harvesting is going to grow below ground where you can't see it. When a plant's growing above ground, it's easy for us to see with our lettuce plants, for example, or our broccoli plants. It becomes pretty easy to see if they're too crowded because you're looking at them and you see them all stuffed in there too close together. With root vegetables, they're down below ground. And so sometimes we can end up with a dense population of those plants. And if they don't have enough room, they're just not going to be able to develop a root. So if you've ever had a problem with growing carrots and harvesting them and having them come out like strings, chances are they probably were planted too close together. So when it comes to root vegetables, spacing varies a lot. Carrots are probably the ones that you can space the closest, 1 inch to 2 inches. In your mind, just think, how wide would my perfect carrot be? How wide would the perfect carrot root be? And then when you're thinning your carrots, use that as the dimension between carrots, because you're going to have 2 halves of a carrot between each of those sprouts, or the equivalent of 1 carrot. So if they are any closer together than your perfect carrot width, you are not going to get perfect carrots. Yep.
Okay, so I always wonder when you have to make it too tiny.
Okay. The question is when to thin, and I'm going to hit that with carrots in just a couple of minutes. So, yep, I have got that on my plate.
Also, yeah, this question. What's the best way to ensure germination?
Oh, okay. Yeah, carrot seed is very slow to germinate, and parsnips as well. They can take 3 weeks before they appear above ground. And so one of the keys is even moisture. So what happens to a seed, when a seed starts to germinate, the first thing it does is, think about when you're planting seeds in a little pot to get them started. The first thing the seed is going to do is it's going to soak up moisture and expand. And once that process starts, it has to keep moving forward. If it stops, the seed will die. So it has to keep moving forward. So that means that once the seed absorbs moisture and expands, it has to stay moist. So you've got to think in terms of, how deep did I plant it, for example, and you've got to keep that soil evenly moist. And so that could mean keeping soil evenly moist for 3 weeks to get your carrots up. And then, of course, in 3 weeks' time, there are a bunch of other plants, weeds of various kinds, that might germinate much faster than your carrots. And so you've also got to monitor your seedling beds. This is neonatal care in your garden, and it involves a lot of intense care to monitor that. But the main problem is going to be insufficient moisture for seeds. That's what usually causes. As long as your seed is not too old or has not been stored properly.
So can you talk about, like that 3 weeks, like last year was a drought in Massachusetts, and I just, there's nothing I could do. I was watering them, but it just got so dry. So how start here?
Okay, question was about the impact of the extreme drought that we had last year. Well, there are a couple of things I'm going to talk a little bit later on about, carrot seed in particular, but these slow seeds and some of the planting issues involved. But providing water during a drought, however you can do it, it's stressful. I know for me, I rely heavily on rain barrels, and rain barrels are great, but when it doesn't rain, you don't have any water in your rain barrels. So you're going to have to use your water. You can shade them, and you can use a shade cloth or something of that nature that will reduce the amount of water evaporation. You're not going to want to have a mulch right on top of emerging seedlings because it can prevent them from emerging. But you can certainly mulch the area between the rows of carrots, and this will help to prevent the loss of moisture from that whole area in your bed of carrots. So no mulch right up tight around the spot where you've planted your seed, but in between your rows, put down a mulch early on, keeps the soil cool, and it will help to prevent moisture loss from that soil.
Mine would dry out by lunchtime.
Right.
An inch.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
where the seed was would be dry.
That's right, because this small seed is going to be in the, the top 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of your soil, and it will dry out quickly. And that can be hard, especially if you're off to work and your garden is sitting by itself. That can be a pretty difficult thing. Yeah. Okay, so crop spacing is going to be really critical. And for things like the root vegetables that I've shown you here, again, think in terms of mature size. So there's a crop spacing for carrots, for beets. You see the beets here. A good sized beet's going to be about 2 or 3 times the size of a carrot. So you're looking at more space. If you're growing rutabagas and you want something this big, those plants are going to have to be that far apart. The hard thing about that thinning is in the beginning, those plants are so tiny that when we look at them, having them be this far apart can really look ridiculous to us, but we've got to think ahead. You can thin gradually, and I'm going to talk a little bit about thinning with some images in just a minute. But if plants are too close together, they don't have room enough to develop. Crowded plants will suffer because they are competing with one another for the nutrients. So it's like, setting up a buffet table for 50 and getting 150 people who come. It's just not going to work. Water availability as well. Plants competing for that. It also reduces air circulation because the foliage of plants is so dense and so close together, and that can raise the chances of these fungal diseases because plant foliage won't dry out fast enough. And again, lack of sunlight, which is the energy source for the plants, but also what dries them out and keeps them healthy. So thinking about stress, root-bound seedlings are stressed. So this is, again, space is not only because of developing the crop, but it's space for the roots to develop into the soil. So when you are purchasing transplants or growing your own transplants, if you're growing your own transplants, make sure that as they grow, they are potted up into larger pots. You don't want to start with a plant that looks like the one that you see here. The roots are growing around and around. Then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to split them, pull them out, what's called butterflying the root ball of the plant, so that the roots will now start to grow out instead of, if you don't do that, they'll just keep growing in a circle. You'll end up with a plant that will stay root bound in the soil and not spread out and be able to access the water and the nutrients it needs. The other thing that is stressful about this is what it will do is it will check the growth of a plant. When a plant starts getting root bound, it shuts down. It can't do its thing. And when plants shut down, that puts them back. If you transplant a root bound plant and open up that root ball, now the plant has got to focus on renewing its root ball. It can't just keep growing forward in your garden. So it suffers a setback. Every setback suffered by a plant is going to minimize its success later on. It slows it down and it makes it less strong. It's not going to be as productive later on. So what we want is when we start a seed, whether it's in a pot or in the ground, we want that plant to start growing and keep growing forward, not go through checks and stops. So how to give plants more space in the garden? There are several ways to do that in a small space. For vining crops, you can grow them on a trellis. I've created what I call my cucumber A-frame in my garden. This nylon mesh is pretty readily available product. I've reused that stuff for probably 10 years. The same nylon mesh, take it indoors, take it back out every year, so it lasts for a long time. It's great for plants where you can train the vines up through the mesh. So you can see some small cucumber plants planted at the base of the mesh here. And then this is what it looks like later on. It takes a little bit of training and discipline. So when you go out into the garden, you're going to steer your vines and kind of weave them in and out through this nylon mesh to spread them out. But it has a great advantage. It saves space. It means that developing fruits are not going to be lying right on the ground where they can suffer from rots or insect problems. And if you're growing these long cucumber varieties, it keeps the fruits nice and straight as they grow. Gravity will keep them nice and straight. So this is a good solution for spacing of cucumbers and other vining crops. And speaking of cucumbers, one of the other things that we need to think about in a garden to keep plants producing well is harvesting them. And this is especially important for the plants that we grow as fruits. Again, those are the plants where the part of the plant that you are going to harvest is the part of the plant that contains the seed. So think peas, beans, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, but particularly the ones that you're going to continually harvest. So cucumbers are a good example. You see a nice ready to harvest cucumber on the left, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see a mature cucumber. So oftentimes we go out into the garden and we discover we've missed a cucumber out there. And all of a sudden, there it is. It's too orange and too mature for us to use as a food harvest. But what you want to do is you want to get it off the vine. You should have harvested it earlier, but don't just say, oh, I'll just leave that one. Because now what has happened, think cucumber is an annual. Its contract with Mother Nature is to produce seed. The minute that that fruit begins to develop seed and ripen seed inside, the cucumber says to itself, job's done, I can shut down now. And when plants begin to fully ripen seed, you're going to stop seeing new production. And so with plants, peas, beans, cucumbers, you want to keep harvesting them. If you miss a few and they've gotten too far along for good eating, don't leave them on the plant. Take them off, put them in the compost, feed them to the chickens, whatever works, but don't leave them on the plant to ripen their seed or your plant's going to start to shut down. This is particularly true of things like beans. Bush beans can be really, really productive. You get an awful lot of beans out there at once. When they start to produce, you want to harvest just about every day to keep those beans producing. You go out and pick off all the ones that are ready to eat, and then go back the next day, pick off all the ones that are ready to eat. Most of these kinds of crops will store for several good days in your refrigerator. But if you leave them on the plant and forget about them, then you're going to shut down production. Also keeping in mind about plants' preferences for temperature, that some like it hot, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, squashes, melons, cukes, beans. These are plants that like hot temperatures. They don't like frost, cold weather, but that there are many that really like it cool. That includes the peas, the lettuce, the broccoli, cauliflowers, cabbages, radishes, kale. These are cool loving crops. So as we begin to plan out the garden, that helps us to think about how we're going to plant things. So what needs to be started indoors or purchased from a greenhouse and then transplanted as a plant into the garden? Those are the plants that are tender, the ones that would suffer if there was a frost, but they're ones that take a long time from the time that you would sow them until you would have a crop ready to harvest. Examples of these include the most common ones: tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. But also onions fall into this category. I'm hoping I'll have time to get to that one. Sure. Then what should be started by direct sowing in the garden? So there are some things that hate to be transplanted. They just don't like it at all. And there are some where growing them ahead and transplanting them just doesn't make any sense. So root vegetables hate transplant. Don't try and transplant carrots and parsnips. They're just not going to do well. They don't adapt to that. So you want to direct sow those in the garden. Potatoes, which we start from tubers, we put those right directly into the garden. Garlic, we plant in the fall directly in our garden. Peas and beans are best sown directly into the garden simply because of the large number of plants you're going to grow and the fact that the seeds germinate really quickly. We gain nothing by trying to start 60 bean plants indoors and then transplant them. They'll be out of the ground a couple days after you put the seed in the ground. You're going to want a lot of plants. So why subject them to transplant stress? Plant them right in the garden. And then Swiss chard and spinach also can suffer from transplant stress. They don't like their roots being disturbed. They'll come along fine from seed right in the garden. So that's the best way. But there are several things that can be started either way. Lettuce is a plant. Of all the plants that I grow, this is the one that's the easiest to transplant. If you're a novice at transplanting things, you don't need to worry about lettuce. It's very forgiving. You damage its roots, it's just going to move right along without any problems at all. And many of the other related greens. Cucumbers, squashes, and melons can be grown either way, but it's worth knowing that cucumbers, squashes, and melons, these are the cucurbits, they don't like root disturbance. They do not like their roots to be disturbed. That will check them and set them back. What this means if you're planting to start them ahead and put them out as transplants, number one, don't start them too early. If you start them indoors too early, like 5 weeks before you can put them out after danger of frost, you're going to end up with a plant that's so big that when you put it in the ground, you can't possibly move it into the ground without disturbing its roots. And that's going to check it and set it back. So about 3 weeks is about the longest ahead that you want to start the seeds of those so that your seedlings will not be too big when you put them out. And make sure you sow them into pots that are going to be large enough to allow the roots to spread out so they don't get root bound at all before you put them into the ground. Personally, I direct sow these plants. I think that you're much less likely to run into problems and they move along quick enough so that you really don't gain much. And if they're checked in growth, the ones you direct sow may speed up and beat the ones that you transplanted anyway. And then cabbages, broccoli, and cauliflower, these are things that can be started either way. We can start them indoors and transplant them. Again, like for almost all our plants, we don't want to start them too early. If you're buying transplants, for example, like things for tomatoes, it can be very tempting when you go to a nursery to buy a tomato plant growing in a pot that's already got tomatoes on it. You think, oh, wow, I'm going to be way ahead of things. But when you put that plant in the ground, now the plant has got to do all of these tasks. It's got to establish a good root system in the ground in order to grow for the full season. But it's already making flowers and tomatoes. So it's got to divide up its available energy on all those tasks. The chances that it's going to succeed at that throughout the growing season are not good. Whereas if you start with a plant it's small and not flowering and fruiting yet, when you put it in the ground, it can focus its attention on getting a good root system established in the ground. Then it can shift gears and go to flowering and fruiting. And chances are, if it doesn't have to do all those things at once, it's going to do each of them much better. So I always tell people I buy some good seed catalogs, not only because I'm going to order seed from them, but some seed catalogs have great culture information in them. And it's in such a quick form that you can easily open it up and get the, how far apart, how deep to sow the seed, how far apart the rows go. It's all right there. And a good example is Territorial Seeds out on the West Coast. This is a 2021 catalog. I haven't ordered from them recently, but I keep this catalog as a garden advice piece. And there are several others here, including New England providers like High Mowing, great advice. And if you order from them, you also get good online follow-up advice from them on culture of vegetables. That's really helpful. And it includes a lot of good things that you're going to want to know about your plant, like days to maturity. How long is it going to take from the time you either put seed in the ground or put a transplant until you can expect to start having harvest from that plant? And then just the simple instructions of how deep to sow the seed, how far apart to set them, to make the rows in the garden, how far apart to thin those plants. So I'm going to skip kind of quickly through lettuce. It's one of the easiest plants to grow, as I said. One of the great advantages of lettuce is you can eat it as soon as it's big enough to put in your mouth, you can eat it. And so you don't have to wait for something to ripen on it. So it's a great plant to put between other plants. It's very hardy. We can put some seed outdoors in the ground as soon as the ground can be worked. And that's an old farmer's phrase. What it means is as soon as the frost has gone out of your ground and as soon as the winter moisture has drained away so the soil is not soggy wet. You don't want to put seed into really, if you can pick that soil up and squeeze it and water runs out, it's too wet to put seed in the ground. Your seed will rot before it germinates. So it should be moist, but like a dried out sponge, not something that you can squeeze out and soak. Lettuce can also be started indoors. Lettuce is one of the few crops that you can easily start just in a sunny window. You don't need a fancy grow light to start your lettuce plants. And they can be just pulled up and then tucked out into the garden. They can be grown anywhere. You can grow them under your ornamentals. You can tuck them in between rows of other plants. So it's a great plant to grow. One of the keys to success is knowing that lettuce seed needs to be able to perceive some light in order to germinate. So what that means is don't cover your lettuce seed too deeply. Just enough soil over the top to surround the seed with soil so it doesn't dry out, but not deep. That also means you're going to have to monitor watering because it's so close to the surface. But if you make a 1-inch trench, drop your lettuce seed in the bottom of it and then cover it up, you may never see any lettuce at all because it hasn't gotten enough light. So if you've had failure with lettuce seed in the past, that's probably the reason why. Probably planted it too deeply. And germination of lettuce seed can be inhibited in hot weather, like over 70, top 70s and 80 degrees, especially when your soil is heated up. Your seed may not germinate well. So we can succession sow. We can every 10 days to 2 weeks plant a small planting of lettuce starting as soon as the ground can be worked. When we get into July and it gets really hot, it may be harder. Then you can try sowing it in a spot where it gets a little shade, or you can try shading the soil for a few days to keep it cool before you put the seed in the ground, or starting the seed in a container in a cooler spot and then transplanting the plants out into your garden. And it appreciates some shade in the summer. So I sow lettuce plants or transplant lettuces under my tripods of pole beans, for example. It's very happy to get a little bit of shade. This is some lettuce seedlings. Seedlings I started in a flat indoors. I just pulled them apart and stuffed them in the ground. You can see there are actually several seedlings together in these areas. Because I'm going to eat it as a salad green, a leaf lettuce, that's not a big problem. That's what it looks like in early July. So lettuce is just so easy to grow. And here it is interplanted between 2 rows of bush beans. We can tuck it in when the bush bean seed gets started. You've got a big space because you've got to space your bush bean rows far apart. Say, oh, no, all this wasted space. Well, sow some lettuce in there. When the beans get so big that they crowd out the lettuce, that's not a problem because you can eat the lettuce at any stage. We pay big bucks for those infant lettuces that we buy in the plastic boxes in the supermarket. And lettuce is also a crop that can extend the season. I have a cold frame, and this is my cold frame. This was a picture that I took in November this year in my cold frame. I ate lettuce out of my cold frame on Christmas Day this year. So you can keep it growing for a long period of time. It will keep you busy for the whole season. Peas are an easy, cool season crop to grow. They are, like I mentioned earlier, a legume, so they actually enrich the soil. Because they're a legume, peas are plants that you can grow pretty close together. They don't need a whole lot of spacing just because they are so efficient at gathering nitrogen. And so you can plant, make a trench. I make a trench and I scatter the seed so it's about 2 inches apart in the trench. Fill that trench about an inch over my seed when it's first planted, and then continue to fill it as the seed grows, because peas like their roots to stay cool. And when the soil begins to heat up, your peas can stop producing. So if I have planted the seed down low, just gradually fill that trench until it's full. Then by the time the soil gets hot, my pea roots are down about 4 inches under the surface. If I've added a mulch on top of that, that allows me to keep those roots growing on cool. Peas also grow with tendrils. That's how they climb, little hair-like structures. The old-fashioned way to grow peas is on what's called pea brush. If you do any pruning around your property, save a pile of fine twiggy branches, push them into the ground, choosing branches that are tall enough to accommodate the height of your peas, which can vary from dwarf ones from 18 inches tall up to peas that are going to need 3 to 4 feet height and even more. So choose twiggy branches that fit, but then this is an old-fashioned method. It keeps the peas up off the ground. It gives them a structure that they evolved to grow on, so it's a really natural way to grow your peas. People also use some of that netting, like I showed you for the cucumbers earlier, or chicken wire, or other material like that. Anything that fine hair-like tendrils can grab onto. Broccoli is a really fussy crop. I used to be able to grow broccoli so easily. Since we've started having extreme hot weather, it has made early crops of broccoli very difficult. And there's a simple reason for this. What broccoli does is it grows up from a seed and it forms a flower bud. That's what we want to harvest, is a bunch of flower buds on the top of our broccoli. When broccoli forms a flower bud, if it does it while the weather is still cool, like between 65 and 70 degrees, that bud will get bigger and bigger and bigger before it flowers. If it's hot, the broccoli will go immediately to flowering and you won't get a flower head on it. And that's what's been happening now. So what happens is we're now starting to get temperatures in the 80s before the end of June. And most of our broccoli that we started in the spring isn't quite at that budding stage by the time that happens. And so instead of making a nice big bud, it just makes flowers and bolts. So this is very tricky. Starting it early indoors and putting out transplants as early as you can. Tricky thing is broccoli can't take a hard frost. It can take light frosts, but not a hard frost. So timing is a little bit tricky for planting it out. It can go earlier than a lot of things, but not as early as lettuce, for example. And getting it in the ground as soon as possible. Making sure your plants are not too big. Like I said earlier, if the plants are too big, that will check the growth. When they go into the ground, they'll kind of get checked and they'll have to reset their root system. If that happens, that slows down your broccoli. What you want your broccoli to do is start growing and moving straight ahead. So make sure your transplants aren't too large when they go in the ground. Make sure you don't disturb their roots. Don't do anything that's going to shut them off and make them pause. We want them to move forward as quickly as possible so that they're making those buds before the temperatures get too hot. What I have found is I've ended up shifting most of my broccoli production to fall now. I grow it as a fall crop. I can start broccoli seedlings midsummer and grow the seedlings on, and then I can either plant them in their final spot, direct sow them, or I can start them in a nursery bed and then transplant them while they're still really small into their final growing area. But then what happens is they're ready to make their buds in late September when the weather is guaranteed to be staying hopefully in that cool range that they really like. Anything that you're going to grow as a fall crop, though, you need to consider if it tells you how many days it takes to mature it from seed to harvest. In the fall, you've got to add on about 10 days to maturity. And the reason for that is the days are shorter in the fall. And so the plant's not getting as much energy. It's not making as much progress day to day as it would if we're growing in the spring when the days are getting longer. 3 minutes. So there's bolting broccoli. I just want to skip ahead. As I said, I'd show you some thinning. So thinning carrots. Here's a bunch of carrot seedlings that have come up. This is about the stage where you want to thin them. As soon as you begin to see some true leaves, at that point you want to thin as early as possible. As somebody mentioned, thinning them can disturb the plants that are left behind. So do it as quick as possible. So here's unthinned broccoli. There's what it looks like after it's thinned. And when you're thinning, I'm not sorry, not broccoli, carrots. Brain is still on the broccoli. When you're thinning carrots and pulling the young ones out, don't drop them on the ground and leave them in the garden. When they break down, they give off an aroma that is a cue to something called the carrot rust fly. And the carrot rust fly will scent that and then move in and lay its eggs on your carrots. And that gives you this messy looking carrot. You can, yeah, then it's away from your garden. You could put them in your compost or, dispose of them, but don't leave them right here. Don't pull them up and just drop them in your carrot row.
There's a request in the chat to talk about cabbage worm advice.
Cabbage worm.
Yep.
Sorry. This happens to me all the time.
I think you breezed past it. When you were skipping ahead. Christie, are you making your PowerPoint available to attendees?
Oh, I probably could. I haven't got that set up.
All right, I'll figure out something by the end of the
I'm sorry. Where my cabbage worm thing went. Cabbage, there are a couple of different kinds of cabbage worms. There's the old-fashioned one that's kind of a blue-gray color, the traditional old cabbage worm. The best thing to do to control those is to watch for them early. So I'm out in my garden early on, turning over leaves. You want to look at the underside of leaves because pests will hide underneath those leaves. And the old-fashioned advice says the best remedy is the hand. And there it is.
Yep.
Okay. So there's my, I get a lot of help from my grandkids. And they love to hunt for bugs, and they're short, or they were. They're not anymore, these two guys. But they would pick the bugs off for me, and that was really helpful. So removing them. The other one is one of a newer pests to arrive, and it's called the cross-striped cabbage worm. And this one is a much bigger problem because when it shows up in large numbers. So you don't only have a couple of these. These are the ones where in your head of broccoli, you separate the broccoli and it's just full of these guys all down inside. So a couple of ways. One thing that I wanted to really recommend is using agricultural row cover, Agribon or Remay. This material is great. You may have seen in some of my images some rows covered with kind of a wire supports and this spread over them, sheets of this. It allows sunlight and moisture to penetrate, so you don't need to worry about any injury to your crops for lack of sun and moisture. And it protects your crops from insects. So any crops where I'm concerned about insects arriving early on, as soon as I get those things growing in the garden, I make these small tunnels over them, tucking this down into the soil to prevent insects from laying eggs on those crops. It can be used over brassicas. The only problem is when it gets really hot, heat can build up under this. So you can run into negative problems when the season gets further along. You may not be able to use it. But BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, is a spray. It's the only concern lately raised about it is if you use it every year, we may be contributing to developing species of these insects that are resistant to BT. But if it's a serious problem, this is, especially if you catch it when the insects are still small, before they get really large, it's a really good control.
I've had a lot of problems with squash vine borer on my zucchini. Is remade helpful?
Yes, it is. I have been able to control squash vine borer using remade. What you need to understand about squashes is that they have both male and female flowers. They're dioecious or monoecious plant. In other words, on one plant, two sexes occur, but in different flowers. That means you can't keep them covered with remade when the flowers open, or you will prevent pollination and you won't get any fruit. However, when I plant my hills of squash, I make these little tents over each of those hills of squash and cover them with remade. And I keep that remade in place until the plants begin to flower. When they begin to flower, I've got to take it off because bees and other flower pollinating insects have got to get in there to move pollen from the male flowers to the female flowers, or I'd never get any squash. And what I found is that the danger of the squash vine borer insect, which is the one you see pictured at the bottom here, that's the highest risk of egg laying from that insect is early in the development of these plants. So if I cover them until they get to their flowering stage, I can exclude that insect. And I have been able to avoid that. The borers will get into the plant. What you will notice if you get those borers is at the base of the vine, you'll see what's called frass. It's this pile of poop, basically, from the borer who has bored its way up through the center of the stem, eating out the vascular part of the stem. We have had success at Sturbridge Village with some plants by carefully performing surgery, slitting one side of that stem up until we find the borer, killing it, and then heaping a mound of soil over that surgical part of the plant. And also in long binding varieties, piling some soil around nodes, parts of the vine that, if you've ever noticed with your long binding squashes, when you remove them at the end of the year, that they've rooted along the vine. So what you want to do is try and encourage that if you've gotten borers, so that you will get more roots to help the plant supply the moisture it needs that it's not getting from that basic root system near the borer. So do I need to stop?
I think
Carol?
so. Yeah. I know, but if you're willing to stay for a few minutes and just chat with folks who have questions, I have a little bit of business to take care of. So for those at home who are still here, I just popped some links into the chat, especially the evaluation. If you can fill out the evaluation online, that would be awesome. And I assume that everyone here is getting an email, who's attending in person is getting an email with the link to the evaluation. So thank you so much for filling that out. It really helps inform future conferences. And
I know what you'll tell me. I need better
you
planning.
have so much great knowledge to share. So the other sessions, if you have any questions about how to access the rest of the session schedule, just see me afterwards. And I just want to make sure we all have an opportunity to say thank you, Christie, for great session.